James and the Giant Peach is the book I will read now for you in ASMR style. So put your headphones in and listen. ASMR Katz. Hello, my beloved mouse. I am happy to see you here on a new ASMR clip where I read the book James and the Giant Peach. It is a very thick book, so I think I will read it in different kind of sessions. This is now the first session where I will start with the book. The book is written by Roald Dahl, and here I have the full book collection I work myself through. So if you are a fan of listening to someone who read for you in ASMR style stories, then it is more than worth it to follow, to subscribe, to click on the notification bell and to comment here to support this YouTube channel. I have two cameras, one here and one there, so I also will make a video clip where you can see inside of the book, because there are some illustrations as well. So let us start. And if you are curious about way more book from Roald Dahl, then feel free to check all my videos and see all the other Roald Dahl books I read. And for the best sound, put your headphones in, because this is a high quality recording. And when you want to enjoy the crystal clear sound, then it makes sense to put the headphones in your ear, that you actually can listen to the quality I provide for you. Introducing James Henry Trotter, Own Spiker, Own Sponge, Old Green Grasshopper, Centipede, Miss Spider, Silky Worm, Glowworm, Earthworm, and Ladybird. This book is for Olivia and Tessa. One. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had a happy life. He lived peacefully, his mother and father, in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was the sandy beach for him to run about on, and the ocean to paddle in. It was a perfect life for a small boy. Then, one day, James' mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up in full daylight by an enormous angry rhinoceros, which headed from the London Zoo. Now, this, as you can all imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his 2 aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I'm sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nuisance," or "you miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house on the top of High Hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny grey dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of bleak-shell blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of the hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spike could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or picnic, and he certainly was not permitted to go alone. The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden, Aunt Spiker has said, and terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in a cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sand pit, and no other children were ever invited to come up to the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't much as a dog or cat around to keep him company, and as time went on, he became sadder and sadder, and more lonely, and he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wisely at the lovely forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. 2. After James, Henry Trotter had been living with his aunt for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which as I saw was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then very peculiar thing in its own turn caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of the summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping the glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for a moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes and sunken mouth, and one of those wide flap faces that looked exactly as though had been boiled. She was like a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed on the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shouting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these two ghastly hags sipping their drinks and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Old Sponge had a long-handled mirror on the lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as Rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face, observe my sharply nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks, and if I take off past my socks, you see my dainty toes, but don't forget how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spike said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curve shape, my teeth, and my charming grin. Oh, beauties me, how I adore my radiant looks. And please ignore the pimple in my chin, my dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried. "You only bones and skin." "Such loveliness as a possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I capture all the nation hearts. They'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign. I think you make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was slaving away that chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was arching. The chopper was a large blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in the gardens. Some would be walking in the cool woods and picking bunches of wild flowers. And all the little friends whom he has to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James' eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all, please, just for once, go down to the seaside or on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him," cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will." She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind the clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we maintained earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry. It was at this point that the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that let so many other much more peculiar things happen to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned around and saw an old man in a funny dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and she stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and cracky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said. "Come right up close to me, and I will show you something. Something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hauled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into the pocket of his jacket and took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James' face. "You know what this is, my dear. You know what's inside this little bag." Then he came nearer, still leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel the breath blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag and titling it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mess of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful. And there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to the move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming up from inside it. And then he noticed that all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very slowly stirring about and moving over each other as thought they were alive. "There's more power and magic in those things in there than in all the rest of the world put together," the old man said softly. "But what are they?" James mourned, finding his voice. "Where do they come from?" "Ah," the old man whispered, "you never guess it." He was crouching a little now and pushing his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin of James' forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues," he cried. 1,000 long slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in skull of a dead witch for 20 days a night with the eyeball of a lizard. At the fingers of a young monkey, the gizzard of a pig, the beak of green parrot, the juice of porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week, and then let the moon do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper back into James' hand and said, "Here, you take it. It is yours." 4. James Henry Trotter stood there clutching the bag and staring at the old man. "And now," the old man said, "all you got to do is this. Take a large judge of water and pour all the little green things into it. Then, very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head. That sets them off. It gets them going. In a couple of minutes, the water will begin to froth, bubble furiously, and as soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole judgeful, in one gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start coming out of your mouth. And immediately after that, marvelous things will start happening to you. Fabulous, unbelievable things. And you will never be miserable again in your life. Because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now, off you go and do exactly as I say. And don't whisper a word of this to those who are horrible aunt of yours. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either. Because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon somebody else instead upon you. And that isn't what you want at all. Is it, my dear? Whoever they meet first, be it a bug, insect, animal, or tree, that will be one who gets the full power of their magic. So hold the bag tight. Don't tear the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time. Hurry. With that, the old man turned away and disappeared in the bushes. 5. The next moment, James was running back toward the house as fast as he could go. He would do it all in the kitchen, he told himself. If only he could get in there without Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker seeing him. He was terribly exhausted. He flew through the long grass on the stinging nettles, not caring whether he got stung or not on his bare knees. And in distance he could see Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker sitting in their chairs with their backs towards him. He swerved away from them so as to go around the other side of the house. But then, suddenly, just as he was passing underneath the old peach tree that stood in the middle of the garden, his foot slipped and he fell flat on his face in the grass. The paper bag burst open as it hit the ground, and thousands of tiny green things was hacked it in directions. James immediately picked himself up on his hands and knees and searching around his precious treasures. But what was this? They were all sinking into the soil. He could actually see them wriggling and twisting as they burrowed their way down into the hard earth, and at once he reached out a hand to pick some of them up before it was too late, but they disappeared right under his fingers. He went after some others, and the same thing happened. He began scrambling around frantically in a effort to catch hold of those that were left, but they were too quick of him. Each time the tips of his fingers were just about to touch them, they vanished into the earth. And soon, in the space of only a few seconds, every single one of them had gone. James felt like crying. He would never get them back now. They was lost forever. But where had they then gone? And why in the world had they been so eager to push down into the earth like that? What were they after? There was nothing down there, nothing except the roots of the old peach tree, and a whole lot of earthworms and centipedes and insects living in the soil. But what was it the old man had said? Whoever they meet first, be it a bug, an insect, animal, or tree, that will be the one who gets the full power of their magic. Good heavens, thought James. What is going to happen in that case if they do meet an earthworm, or a centipede, or a spider? And what if they go into the roots on the peach tree. "Get up at once, you lazy little beast," a voice was suddenly shouting. James glanced up and saw Aunt Spiker standing over him, grim and tall and bony, glaring at him through her steel-rimmed spectacles. "Get back over there immediately and finish chopping up those logs," she ordered. Aunt Sponge, fat and pulpy as a yellfish, came waddling up behind her sister to see what was going on. "Why don't we just lower the boy down the well in a bucket and leave him there for a night?" she suggested. "That ought to teach him not to lazy around like this whole day long." "That's a very good wheeze, my dear Sponge, but let's make him finish chopping of the wood first. Be off with you at once, you hide-house brat, and do some work." Slowly, sadly, poor James got up off the ground and went back to the wood pile. Oh, if he hadn't slipped and fallen and dropped that precious bag. All hope of happier life had gone completely now. Today and tomorrow and the next day and all the other days as well would be nothing but punishment and pain and unhappiness and despair. He picked up the chopper and was just about to start chopping away again when he heard a shout behind them, made him stop and turn. 6. "Sponge, Sponge, come here at once and look at this." "At what?" "It's a peach," Aunt Spiker was shouting. "A what?" "A peach, right up there on the highest branch. Can you see it?" "I think you must be mistaken, my dear Spike. That miserable tree had never a peach once." "There's one. You look for yourself." "You're teasing me, Spiker. You're making my mouth water on purpose when there's nothing to put in it. Why, that tree's never even had a blossom on it." "Right up on the highest branch, you say. I can't see a thing. Very funny. Good gorgeous me. Well, I be blowed. There's really a peach up there. A nice big one, too." Aunt Spiker said. "A beauty," Aunt Sponge cried out. At this point, James slowly put down his chopper and turned and looked across at the two women who were standing underneath the peach tree. "Something is about to happen," he told himself. "Something peculiar's about to happen any moment." He hadn't the faintest idea what it might be, but he could feel it in his bones that something was going to happen soon. He could feel it in the air around him, in the sudden stillness that had fallen upon the garden. James tippy-toed a little closer to the tree. The aunts were not talking now. They were just standing there, staring at the peach. There was not a sound anywhere. Not even a breath of wind, and overhead the sun blazed down upon them out of the deep blue sky. "It looks ripe to me," Aunt Spiker said, breaking the silence. "Then why don't we eat it?" Aunt Sponge suggested, licking her thick lips. "We can't have a half each. Hey, you, James, come over here at once and climb this tree." James came running over. "I want you to pick the peach up there on the highest branch," Aunt Sponge went on. "Can you see it?" "Yes, Aunt Sponge, I can see it." "And don't you dare eat any of it yourself. Your Aunt Spiker and I are going to have it between us, right here and now, half each. Get one with it. Up you go." James crossed over the tree trunk. "Stop," Aunt Spike said quickly. "Hold everything." She was staring up in the branches with her mouth wide open and her eyes bulging as though she had seen a ghost. "Look," she said. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Sponge demanded. It's growing, Aunt Spiker cried. It's getting bigger and bigger. What is the peach? Of course. You're joking. Well, look for yourself. But my dear Spiker, that's perfectly ridiculous. That's impossible. No, wait, just a minute. No, that can't be right. No, yes. Great Scott, the thing really is growing. It's nearly twice as big already, Aunt Spiker shouted. It can't be true. It is true. It must be a miracle. Watch it. I am watching it. Great heavens alive, Aunt Spiker yelled. I can actually see the thing bulging and swelling before my very eyes. Seven. The two women and the small boy stood absolutely still on the grass underneath the tree, gazing up at this extraordinary fruit. James' little face was glowing with excitement. His eyes were as big and bright as the two stars. He could see the peach swelling larger and larger, as clearly as if it were a balloon being blown up. In half a minute, it was the size of a melon. In another half minute, it was twice as big again. Just look at it growing, Aunt Spiker cried. Will it ever stop? Aunt Sponge shouted, waving her fat arms and starting to dance around in cycles. And now it was so big, it looked like an enormous butter-colored pumpkin dangling from the top of the tree. Get away from the tree trunk, you stupid boy, Aunt Spiker yelled. The slightest shake, and I am sure it'd fall off. It must weigh 20 or 30 pounds at least. The branch that the peach was growing upon was beginning to bend over, further and further because of the weight. Stand back, Aunt Sponge shouted. It's coming down. The branch is going to break. But the branch didn't break. It simply bent over more and more as the peach got heavier and heavier. And still it went on growing. In another minute, this marmot fruit was as large and round and fat as Aunt Sponge herself, and probably just as heavy. It has to stop now, Aunt Spiker yelled. It can't go on forever. But it didn't stop. Soon it was the size of a small car and reached halfway to the ground. Both aunts were now hopping round and round the tree, clapping their hands and shouting all sorts of silly things in their excitement. Hallelujah, Aunt Spiker shouted. What a peach. Terrific, Aunt Sponge cried out. Magnificent. And what a meal. It's still growing. I know. As for James, he was spellbound by the whole thing that he could only stand and stare and murmur quietly to himself. Oh, isn't it beautiful? It's the most beautiful thing I ever seen. Shut up, little twerp, Aunt Spiker snapped, happening to overhear him. It's none of your business. That's right, Aunt Sponge declared. It's got nothing to do with whatsoever. Keep out of it. Look, Aunt Spiker shouted. It's growing faster than ever now. It's speeding up. I see it, Spiker, I do. Bigger and bigger grew the peach, bigger and bigger. Then, at least when it had come nearly as tall as the tree that it was growing on, as tall and wide, in fact, as a small house, the bottom part of it gently touched the ground, and there it rested. It can fall off now, Aunt Spiker shouted. It stopped growing, Aunt Spiker cried. No, it hasn't. Yes, it has. It's slowing down, Spiker. It's slowing down. But it hasn't stopped yet. You watch it? There was a pause. It has now. I believe you're right. Do you think it's safe to touch it? I don't know. We better be careful. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker began walking slowly around the beach, inspecting it very consciously from all sides. They were like a couple of hunters who had just shot an elephant and were not quite sure whether it was dead or alive. And the massive round fruit towered over them so high that they looked like midgets from another world beside it. Then, skin of the peach was very beautiful, a rich buttery yellow with patches of brilliant pink and red. Aunt Sponge advanced cautiously and touched it with the tip of one finger. It's ripe, she cried. It's just perfect. Now look at her, Spiker. Why don't we go and get a shovel right away and dig out a great big chunk of it? For you and for me to eat. No, Aunt Spiker said, not yet. Why ever? No, because I say so. But I can't wait to eat some, Aunt Sponge cried out. She was watering at the mouth now, and the thin trickle of spit was running down on the side of her chin. My dear Sponge, Aunt Spiker said slowly, winking at her sister and smiling a sly, thin-lipped smile. There is a pile of money to be made out of this, if only we can handle it right. You wait and see. 8. The news that the peach almost as big as a house had suddenly appeared in someone's garden spread like a wildfire across the countryside. And the next day, a stream of people came scrambling up the steep hill to gaze upon this marvel. Quickly, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker called in carpenters and had them build a strong fence around the peach to save it from the crowd. And at the same time, these two crafty women stationed themselves at the front gate with a large bunch of tickets and started charging everyone for coming in. Roll up, Aunt Spiker yelled. Only the shilling to see the giant peach. Half a price for children under 6 years old, Aunt Sponge shouted. One at a time, please. Don't push. You are all going to get in. Hey, you, come back there. You haven't paid. By lunchtime, the whole place was a seething mass of men, women, and children, all pushing and shoving to get a glimpse of this miracle's fruit. Helicopters were landing like wasps all over the hill, and out of them poured swarms of newspaper reporters, cameramen, and men from the television companies. It all will cost you double to bring in cameras, Aunt Spike shouted. All right, they answered. We don't care. And the money came rolling into the pockets of the true greedy aunts. But while all this excitement was going on outside, poor James was forced to stay locked in his bedroom, peeping through the bars of his window at the crowds below. The disgusting little brute will only get in everyone's way if we let him wander about, Aunt Spiker had said early this morning. Oh, please, he had begged. I haven't met any other children for years, and there are going to be lots of them down there for me to play with. And perhaps I could help you with the tickets. Shut up, Aunt Sponge had snapped. Your Aunt Spiker and I are about to become millionaires, and the last thing we want to see is you messing things up and getting in the way. Later, when the evening of the first day came in, the poor had all gone home. The ounce unlocked James' door and ordered him to get outside and pick up all the banana skin and orange peel and bits of paper that Crowd had left behind. "Could I please have something to eat first?" he asked. "I haven't had a thing all day." "No," they shouted, kicking him out of the door. "We are too busy to make food. We are counting money." "But it's dark," cried James. "Get out," they yelled, "and stay out until you cleaned up all the mess." The door slammed. The key turned in the lock. 9. Hungry and trembling, James stood alone out in the open, wondering what to do. The night was all around him now, and high overhead a wild white moon was riding in the sky. There was not a sound, not a move, nothing. Most people, and especially small children, are often quite scared of being outdoors alone in the moonlight. Everything is deadly quiet, and the shadows are so long and black, and they kept turning into strange shapes that seem to move as you look at them, and the slightest little snap of twig makes you jump. James felt exactly like that now. He stared straight ahead with large frightened eyes, hardly daring to breathe. Not far away, in the middle of the garden, he could see the giant peach towering over everything else. Surely it was even bigger tonight than ever before. And what a dazzling sight it was. The moonlight was shining and glinting on its great curving sides, turning them to the crystal and silver. It looked like a tremendous silver ball lying there in the grass, silent, mysterious, and wonderful. And then, all at once, little shivers of excitement started running over the skin on James' back. Something else, he told himself, something stranger than ever this time, is about to happen to me again soon. He was sure of it. He could feel it coming. He looked around him, wondering what on earth it was going to be. The garden lay soft and silver in the moonlight. The grass was wet with dew, and a million dewdrops were sparkling and twinkling like diamonds around his feet. And now, suddenly the whole place, the whole garden seemed to be alive with magic. Almost without knowing what he was doing, a thought drawn by the same power magnet. James Henry Trotter started to walk slowly towards the giant peach. He climbed over the fence to the giant that rounded it and stood directly beneath it, staring up at its great bulging sides. He put out a hand and touched it gently with the tip of a finger. It felt soft and warm and slightly furry, like the skin of a baby mouse. He moved a step closer and rubbed his cheek lightly against the soft skin. And then, suddenly, while he was doing this, he happened to notice that right beside him and below him, close to the ground, there was a hole in the side of the peach. 10. It was a quite large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't a hole, he thought. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was a curious bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his skin. The walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of a woman's tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as thought the tunnel were leading straight towards the very center of the giant fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bit out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelous refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking the way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as tough it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. "Good heavens," he said, "I know what this is. I've come to a stone in the middle of the peach." Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of this peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here," and another one, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and stared at the speakers. His face was white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was only a solid brown wall behind him. 11. James' large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creators, some sitting on chairs, others sitting on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creators? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog. You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper, as large as a dog, sitting directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider, there was a giant ladybird with 9 black spots on her scaled shell. Each of the 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, recently comfortable, curled up position, there were a centipede and an earthworm. And the floor, over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as thought it might be a silkworm. But it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying attention to it. Everyone on these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring at James. "I am famished," the old green grasshopper said. "So am I," the ladybird cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everyone's famished," he said. "We need food." 4 pairs round black glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling move with his body, as thought he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue directly over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked, suddenly leaning forward and addressed herself to James. Poor James was packed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the old green grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as thought he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing," the ladybird cried. "I do believe he thinks it's him that we're wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all the sides. Oh dear, they said. What an awful thought. You mustn't be frightened, the ladybird said kindly. We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now, didn't you know that? You are one of the crew. We are all in the same boat. We've been waiting for you all day long. The old green grasshopper said, We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it. So cheer up, my boy, cheer up, the centipede said. And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with those wood. Took me for hours to get all of them off by myself. 12. James decided that his was most certainly not a time to be disarranged. So he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. Thank you so much, the centipede said. You are very kind. You have a lot of boots, James mourned. I have a lot of legs, the centipede answered proudly, and a lot of feet. 100 to be exact. There he goes again, the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyway, there's nothing marvelous, centipede about having a lot of legs. Poor fellow, the centipede said, whispering in James' ear. He's blind. He can see how splendid I look. In my opinion, the earthworm said, the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all, and to be able to walk just the same. You call that walking? Cried the centipede. You are a slitherer, that's all you are. You just slide along. I glide, said the earthworm primly. You are a slimy beast, answered the centipede. I am not a slimy beast, the earthworm said. I am a useful and much loved creature, as any gardener you like, and as for you, I am a pest, the centipede announced, grinning broadly and looking round the room for approval. He is so proud of that, the ladybird said, smiling at James. So, for the life of me, I cannot understand why. I am the only pest in this room, cried the centipede, still grinding away. Unless you count old green grasshopper over there. But he is long past it now. He is too old to be past any more. The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a weltering look. Young fellow, he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice. I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician. Here, said the ladybird. James, the centipede said. Your name is James, isn't it? Yes. Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous colossal centipede as me? I certainly haven't, James answered. How on earth did you get to be like that? Very peculiar, the centipede said. Very, very indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden under the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose. Bright green it was, and extraordinary beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stones or crystal. Oh, but I know what that was, cried James. It happened to be too, said the ladybird. And me, Miss Spider said. Suddenly, there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them. I actually swallowed one, the earthworm declared proudly. So did I, a ladybird said. I swallowed 3, the centipede cried. But who's telling the story anyway? Don't interrupt. It's too late to tell the story now, the old green grasshopper announced. It's time to go to sleep. I refuse to sleep in my boots, the centipede cried. How many more there are to come off, James? I think I've done about 20 so far, James told him. Then that leaves 8 to go, the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. He's lying again. The centipede roared with laughter. Stop pulling the earthworm's legs, the ladybird said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. Pulling his leg, he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. Which leg am I pulling? You tell me. James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker laughing. We really must get some sleep, the old green grasshopper said. We've got a tough day ahead on tomorrow. So would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds? 13. A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so that actually it looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. I do hope you find it comfortable, Miss Spider said to the old green grasshopper. I made it as soft and silky as possible. I spoon with the gossamer. That is a much better quality thread than the one I use for my own web. Thank you so much for that, my dear, the old green grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. Ah, this is just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and the ladybird got in. After that, she spun along of the centipede and even longer for the earthworm. And how do you like your bed, she said to James. Hard or soft? I like it soft. Thank you very much, James answered. For goodness sake, stop staring round the room and get one with my boots, the centipede said. You and I are never going to get any sleep at this rate. And kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder. James worked away frantically at the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off. And to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most terrible, complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours, and by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all and had lined them up in the row on the floor, 21 pairs also, the centipede was fast asleep. Wake up, centipede, whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. It's time for your bed. Thank you, my dear child, the centipede said, opening his eyes. Then he got down off the sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into the hammock. James got into his hammock, and oh, how soft and comfortable it was, with the hard bare boards that his aunt had always made him sleep upon at home. Light out, the centipede rolls. Nothing happened. Turn out the light, he called, raising his voice. James glanced around the room, wondering which of the others might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The gold-green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybird was making whistling noises as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at one end of his hammock, whizzing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the very center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. I said turn off the light, shouted the centipede angrily. Are you talking to me? James asked him. Of course I'm not talking to you, you ass, the centipede answered. That crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on. For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up the ceiling, and there he saw a most extraordinary sight. something that looked like a giant fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long, was standing upside down upon its 6 legs and in the middle of the ceiling, and the tail of this creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright and as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. "It's that glowworm?" asked James, staring at the light. "It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to me." "Of course it's a glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that's what she calls herself. Also, actually, you are quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They are simply lady fireflies without wings." "Wake up, you lazy beast." But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked one of his boots from the floor. "But out that wretched light," he shouted, hurling the boot up the ceiling. The glowworm slowly opened an eye and started at the centipede. "There's no need to be rude," she said coldly. "All in good time." "Come on," shouted the centipede, "or I put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," the glowworm said, looking down and giving James a little wave and smile. "I didn't see you come in." "Welcome, my dear boy, and good night." Then, click, and out went the light. James Henry Trottier lay down there in the darkness, with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they were not nearly terrible at all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful, in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went in between them. "Good night, old green grasshopper," he was whispered. "Good night, ladybird. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he could go through them all, he had fallen fast asleep. 14. "We are off," some was shouting. "We are off at last." James woke up with a jump and looked about him. The creatures were all out of their hammocks and moving externally around the room. Suddenly, the floor gave a great heave, as though an earthquake were taking place. "Here we go," shouted the old green grasshopper, hopping up and down with excitement. "Hold on tight." "What's happening?" cried James, leaping off his hammock. "What's going on?" The ladybird, who was obviously a kind and gentle creature, came over and stood beside him. "In case you don't know it," she said, "we are about to depart. For every form, the top of the ghastly hill that we all been living on for so long. We are about to roll away, inside this great big beautiful peach to land off." "Of what?" asked James. "Never you mind," said the ladybird, "but nothing could be worse than his desolate hilltop on those 2 repulsive aunts of yours." "Here, here," they all shouted. "You may not have noticed it," the ladybird went on, "but the whole garden, even before it reached the steep edge of the hill, happens to be a steep slope. And therefore the only thing that has been stopping this peach from rolling away right from the beginning is the thick stem attached to the tree. Break the stem and off we go." "Watch it," cried Mr. Spider as the room gave another violent lurch. "Here we go." "No, not quite. At this moment," continued the ladybird, "our centipede, who has a pair of jaws as sharp as razors, is up there on the top of the peach, nibbling away at the stem. In fact, he must be nearly through it, as you can tell from the way we are lunching about. Would you like me to take you under my wings so that you won't fall over when we start rolling?" "That's very kind of you," said Mrs. James, "but I think I'll be all right." Just then, the centipede stuck his grinding face through a hole in the ceiling and shouted, "I've done it, we are off." "The journey begins," shouted the centipede. "And who knows where it will end," muttered the earthworm. "If you have anything to do with it, it can only mean trouble." "Nonsense," said the ladybird. "We are now about to visit the most marvelous places and see the most wonderful things. Isn't that so, centipede?" "There is no knowing what we shall see," cried the centipede. "We may see a creature with 9 heads, who lives in the desolate snow, and whenever he catches the cold, he has 49 noses to blow. We might see the venomous pink-spotted scrunch, who can chew up a man with one bite. It likes to eat 5 of them roasted for lunch and 18 for its supper at night. We may see a dragon, and nobody knows that we won't see a unicorn there. We may see a terrible monster with toes growing out of the tufts of his hair. We may see the sweet little bitty bride, hen, so playful, so kind and well-bred, and such beautiful eggs, you just boil them and then they explode and they blow off your head. A gnu and a gnorris surely you see, and that gnormus and gnorbly gnat, who sting when it stings, your goes in a knee and comes out through the top of your hut. And we may even get lost and be frozen by frost. We may die in an earthquake or tremor. Or nastier still, we may even be tossed on the horns of a perilous dilemma. But who cares? Let us go from this horrible hill. Let us rock, let us bowl, let us plunge. Let's go rolling and bowling and spinning until we are away from the old spiker and sponge. 1 second later, slowly and endlessly, oh most gentle, the great peach started to lean forward and steal into narration. The whole room began to tilt over and all the furniture went sliding across the floor and crashed against the far wall. So did James and the ladybird and the old green grasshopper and Miss Spider and the earthworm and also the centipede, who had just came slithering quickly down the wall. 15. Outside in the garden at the very moment, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker had just taken their places at the front gate, each with a bunch of tickets in her hand, and the first stream of early morning strictures was visible in the distance climbing up the hill to the view of the peach. "We shall make a furniture day," Aunt Spiker was saying. "Just look at all those people. I wonder what became of the horrid little boy of our last night," Aunt Sponge said. "He never did come back in, did he?" "He probably fell down in the dark and broke his leg," Aunt Spiker said. "Or his neck, maybe," Aunt Sponge said hopefully. "Just wait till I get my hands on him," Aunt Spiker said, waving her cane. "He never want to stay out all night again." Good gracious me, what's that awful noise? Both women swung around the log. The noise, of course, had been caused by the giant peach crashing through the fence that surrounded it, and now gathering speed every second, it came rolling across the garden towards the place where Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker was standing. They gaped, they screamed, they started to run. They panicked. They both got in each other's way. They began pushing and jostling, and each one of them was thinking only about saving themselves. Aunt Sponge at the fat on tripped over a box that she'd brought along to keep the money in, and fell flat on her face. Aunt Spiker immediately tripped over Aunt Sponge and came down on the top of her. They both lay on the ground, frightening and glaring and yelling and struggling frantically to get up again. But before they could do this, the mighty peach was upon them. There was a crunch, and then there was silence. The peach rolled on, and behind it, out Sponge and Spiker lay ironed out open the grass, as flat and thin and live as a couple of paper dolls cut out of the picture book. 16. Mm. 16 I will read in the next. And now the peach had broken out of the garden and was over the edge of the hill, rolling and bouncing down the steep slope at a terrific pace. Faster and faster it went, and the crowds of people who were climbing up the hill suddenly caught sight of this terrible monster plunging down upon them, and they screamed and scattered to the right and left. It went hardly by. At the bottom of the hill, it charged across the road, knocking over the telegraph pole and flattening 2 parked cars as it went by. Then it rushed madly across about 20 fights, breaking down all the fence and hedges and its paths. It went right through the middle of a herd of fine Jersey cows, and then through a flock of sheep, and then through a paddock full of horses, and then through a yard full of pigs. And soon the whole countryside was a seething mess of panic-stricken animals, stamping in all directions. The peach was still going at a tremendous speed with no signs of slowing down, and about a mile farther and it came to the village. Down the main street of the village it rolled, with people leaping frantically out of its path right and left. And at the end of the street it went crashing right through the wall of an enormous building and out the other side, leaving 2 gaping round holes in the brickwork. This building happened to be a famous factory where they made chocolate, and almost at once a great river of warm melted chocolate came pouring out of the holes in the factory wall. A minute later, the brown sticky mess was flying through every street in the village, oozing under the doors of houses and into people's shops and gardens. Children were wading in it up the knees, and some were even trying to swim in it, and all of them were sicking it into their mouths in great greedy gulps and shrieking with you. But the peach rushed on across the countryside, on and on and on, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Couch stables, pigsties, barns, bungalows, hayricks, anything that got in its way went just topping over like a ninepine. An old man, sitting quietly beside a stream, had his fishing rod withered out of his hands as it went dashing by, and a woman called Daisy Entwist was standing so close to it, it passed that she had the skin taken off the tip of her long nose. Would it ever stop? Why should it? A round object will always keep on rolling as long as it is on downhill slope. And in this case, the land sloped downhill all the way until it reached the ocean. The same ocean that James had begged his aunt to be allowed to visit one day. Well, perhaps he was going to visit it now. The peach was rushing closer and closer to it every second, and closer also the towering white cliffs that came first. These cliffs are the most famous in the whole of England, and they are hundreds of feet high. Below them, the sea is deep and cold and hungry. Many ships have been swallowed up in the last 4 even of this part of the coast, and all the men who were in this as well. The peach was now only 100 yards away from the cliff, now 50, now 20, now 10. And when it reached the edge of the cliff, it seemed to leap up in the sky and hang there suspended for a few seconds, still turning over and over in the air. Then it began to fall. Down. Down and down. Smack. It hit the water with colossal splash and sank like a stone. But a few seconds later, up it came again, and this time up it stayed, floating serenely upon the surface of the water. 17. At this moment, the scene inside the peach itself was one of an incredible choice. James Henry Trotter was lying bruised and battered on the floor of the room, all along the tangled mass of centipede and earthworm and spider and ladybird and glowworm and old grasshopper. In the whole history of the world, no travelers had ever had more terrible journey than these unfortunate creatures. It had started out well, with much laughing and shouting, and for the first few seconds as the peach had begun to roll slowly, nobody had minding being tumbled a little bit. And when it went pump, and the centipede had shouted, that was our sponge. And then pump again, that was our spiker. There had been a tremendous burst of cheering all around. But as soon as the peach rolled out of the garden and began to go down the deep hill, rushing and blocking and bounding madly downward, then the whole thing became a nightmare. James found himself being flummed up against the ceiling, then back on the floor, then sideways against the wall, then up on the ceiling again, and up and down and back and forth and round, and at the same time all the other creatures were flying through the air in every direction. And so were the chairs and the sofa, not to maintain the 42 boots belonged to the centipede. Everything and all of them were being related around like peas, inside an enormous rattle that was being rattled by a mad giant who refused to stop. To make it worse, something went wrong with the glowworm's lighting system, and the room was in pitch darkness. There were screams and yells and curses and cries of pain, and everything kept going round, and once James made a frantic grab at some thick bars sticking out from the wall, only to find the way were a couple of centipede's legs. "Let go, you idiot," shouted the centipede, kicking himself free, and James was promptly flung across the room into the old green grasshopper's horny lap. Twice he got tangled up in Miss Spider's legs, a horrid business, and towards the end, the poor earthworm, who was cracking himself like a whip every time he flew through the air from one side of the room to the other, coiled himself around James' body in a panic and refused to unwind. Oh, it was frantic and terrible trip. But it was all over now, and the room was suddenly very, very still and quiet. Everybody was begging slowly and painfully to disengage himself from everybody else. "Let's have some light," shouted the centipede. "Yes," they cried. "Light, give us some light." "I'm trying," answered the poor glowworm. "I'm doing my best. Please be patient." They all waited in silence. Then a faint greenish light began to glimmer out of the glowworm's tail, and this gradually became stronger and stronger until it was anyway enough to see by. "Some great journey," the centipede said, limpering across the room. "I shall never be the same again," moaned the earthworm. "No, the ladybird said. "It's taken years of my life." "But my dear friends," cried the old grasshopper, trying to be cheerful, "we are there." "Where?" they asked. Where is there?" "I don't know," the grasshopper said, "but I bet it's somewhere good." "We are probably at the bottom of a coal mine," the earthworm said. "We certainly went down and down for suddenly at least a time. I felt it in my stomach. I still feel it." Perhaps we are in the middle of a beautiful country full of songs and music, the old grasshopper said, or near the seashore, with lots of other children down on the sand for me to play, said James. Pardon me, murmured the ladybird, turning a trifle pale, but I am wrong in thinking that we seem to be bobbing up and down? Bobbing? They cried. What on earth do you mean? You're still giddy from the journey, the old green grasshopper told her. You get over it in a minute. Is everybody ready to go upstairs now and take a look around? Yes, they called. Come on, let's go. I refuse to show myself out of the doors in my bare feet, the centipede said. I have to get my boots in again first. For heaven's sake, let's not go through all that nonsense again, the earthworm said. Let's all lend the centipede a hand and it get over with. Come on. So they did all except Miss Spider, who has about weaving a long rope ladder that would reach from the floor up to the whole ceiling. The old green grasshopper had wisely said that they must not risk going out of the side entrance when they didn't know where they are. But most first of all, go up on the top of the peach and have a look around. So half an hour later, when the rope ladder had been finished and hung, and the 42nd boot has been laced neatly, and the centipede's 42nd foot there were already go out, amidst mounting excitement and shouts of, "Here we go, boys, the promised land. I can't wait to see it." The whole company climbed up the ladder and by one and disappeared into a dark, soggy tunnel on the ceiling that went steeply, almost vertical upward. 18. A minute later, they were out in the open standing on the very top of the peach, near the steam, blinking their eyes in the strong sunlight and peering nervously around. What happened? Where are we? This is impossible, unbelievable, terrible. I told you we were booping and down, the ladybird said. We're in the middle of the sea, cried James. And indeed they were. A strong current and high wind had carried the peach so quickly away from the shore that already the land was out of sight. All around them lay the vast black ocean, deep and hungry. Little waves were bibbling against the sides of the peach. But how did it happen? They cried. Where are the fields? Where are the woods? Where is England? Nobody, not even James, could understand how in the world a thing like this could have come about. Ladies and gentlemen, the grasshopper said, trying very hard to keep the fear and disappointment out of his voice. I am afraid that we find ourselves in a rather awkward situation. Awkward? Cried the earthworm. My dear old grasshopper, we are finished. Every one of us is about to perish. I may be blind, you know, but that much I can see, and I see it quite clearly. Off with my boots, shouted the centipede. I cannot swim with my boots. I can't swim at all, cried the ladybird. Nor can I, wailed the glowworm. Nor I, said Miss Spider. None of us 3 girls can swim a single stroke. But you want to have a swim, said James calmly. We are floating beautifully, and sooner or later a ship is bound to come along and pick us up. They all stared at him in amazement. Are you quite sure that we are not sinking? The ladybird asked. Of course I'm sure, answered James. Go and look for yourself. They all ran over the side of the peach and peered down at the water below. The boy is quite right, the old green grasshopper said. We are floating beautifully. Now we must all sit down and keep perfectly calm. Everything will be all right in the end. Absolutely nonsense, cried the earthworm. Nothing is ever all right in the end, and well, you know it. Poor earthworm, the ladybird said, whispering in James' ear. He loves to make everything into a disaster. He hates to be happy. He's only happy when he's gloomy. Now, isn't that odd? But then, I suppose just being an earthworm is enough to make a person pretty gloomy, don't you agree? If this peach is not going to sink, the earthworm said, and if we are not going to be drowned, then every one of us going to starve to death instead. Do you realize that we haven't a thing to eat since yesterday morning? By golly, he's right, cried the centipede. For one, the earthworm is right. Of course I'm right, the earthworm said, and we are not likely to find anything around here either. We shall get thinner and thinner, and thirstier, and we shall all die as slow and grisly deaths from starvation. I am dying already. I am slowly shivering up for want of food. Personally, I would rather drown. But God heavens, you must be blind, said James. You know very, very well I'm blind, snapped the earthworm. There's no need to rub it in. I didn't mean that, said James quickly. I'm sorry, but can you see that? See? Shouted the poor earthworm. How can I see if I am blind? James took a deep, slow breath. Can't you realize, he said patiently, that we have enough food here at least for 4 weeks? Where? They said. Where? Why, the peach, of course. Our whole ship is made of food. Yeah, you are right, they cried. We never thought of that. My dear James, said the grasshopper, lying in front of Leg and James' shoulders. I don't know what I'd do without you. You are so clever. Ladies and gentlemen, we are saved again. We are most certainly not, said the earthworm. You must be crazy. You can't eat the ship. It is the only thing that is keeping us up. We shall starve if we don't, said the centipede, and we shall drown if we do, cried the earthworm. Oh dear, said the grasshopper, now we are worse off than before. Couldn't we just eat a little bit of it? Asked Miss Spider. I'm so hungry. You can eat all you want, James answered. It would take us weeks and weeks to make any sort of a dent in this enormous peach. Surely you can see it. Good heaven, he's right again, cried the grasshopper, clapping his hands. It would take weeks. Of course it would. But let's not get making a lot of holes all over the deck. I think we are better simply scoop it out of the tunnel over there, the one that we just came up. An excellent idea, said the ladybird. Where are you looking so worried about, earthworm? The centipede asked. What is the problem? The problem is, the earthworm said, the problem is, well, there is no problem. Everyone burst out laughing. Cheer up, earthworms, they said. Come and eat. And they all went over the tunnel entrance and began scooping out great chunks of juicy golden-colored peach flesh. Oh, marvelous, said the centipede, stuffing into his mouth. Delicious, said the grasshopper. Just fabulous, the glowworm. Oh my, said the ladybird, what a heavenly taste. She looked up at James and she smiled, and James smiled back at her. They sat down on the deck together, both of them chewing away happily. You know, James, the ladybird said, up until this moment I have never in my life tasted anything except those tiny little green fries that live in the rose bushes. They have a perfectly delightful flavor, but this peach is even better. Isn't it glorious, Miss Spider said, coming over to join them. Personally, I had always thought that a big juicy cord in the web was the finest dinner in the world, until I tasted this. What a flavor, the centipede cried. It's terrific. There's nothing like it. There never have been. and I should know because I personally have tasted all the finest foods in the world. And then they suddenly burst into a song. I've eaten many strange and scrambled dishes in my time, like jellied nuts and dandybrats and earwigs cooked in slime. And mice with rice, they all are nice when roasted in their prime. But don't forget to sprinkle them with just a pinch of grime. I've eaten fresh murder bugs by the greatest cooks there are, and scrambled dregs and stinkerbug eggs and hornets stewed in tar, and pails of snails and lizard tails and beetles by the jar. A beetle is improved by just a splash of vinegar. I often eat boiled slobbecs, they're grand when they served beside minced doodlebugs and currant slugs, and have ever tried mosquito toes and whamfish rolls, most delightfully fried. The only trouble is the disgrace within me inside. I am mad for crispy warspings on a piece of butter toast, and pickled spines of porcupines, and then a gorgeous roast of dragon's flesh, well hung not fresh, it's cost a pound of most, and comes to you in a barrels if you order it by the post. I crave the taste tentacles of the octopi for tea. I liked hot dogs. I love hot frogs, and surely you agree. I plate of soil with engine oil, a super recipe. I hardly need to maintain that's practical for free. For dinner on my birthday, I tell you what. I choose hot noodles made from poodles and a slice of golden hass, and a rather small jelly made of armadillo's toes. The jelly is delicious, but you have to hold your nose. Now comes the centipede declared, the burden of my speech. These foods are rare beyond compare, some are right out of their reach. But there's no doubt I go without a million plates of each, for one small mite, one tiny bite of this fantastic peach. Everybody was feeling happy now. The sun was shining brightly out of a soft blue sky, and the day was calm. The giant peach, with the sunlight glinting on its side, was like a massive golden ball sailing upon a silver sea. 19. Look, cried the centipede just as they were finished their meal. Look at the funny black thing gliding through the water over there. They all swung around to look. There are 2 of them, said Miss Spider. There are lots of them, said the ladybird. What are they? Asked the earthworm, getting worried. They must be some kind of fish, said the old grasshopper. Perhaps they have came along and say hello. They are sharks, cried the earthworm. I bet you anything you like that they are sharks and they have come along to eat us up. What's about rot? The centipede said. But his voice seemed suddenly to have become a little shaky, and he wasn't laughing. I'm positive they are sharks, said the earthworm. I just know they are sharks. And so, in actual fact, did everybody else, but they were too frightened to admit it. There was a short silence. They all peered down anxiously at the sharks who were very curiously slowly round and round the peach. Just amusing that they are sharks, the centipede said, there still can possibly be in danger if we stay up here. But even as he spoke, one of the thin black fins suddenly changed direction and came cutting swiftly through the water right up to the side of the peach itself. The shark paused and stared up the companion with small, evil eyes. Go away, they shouted. Go away, the filthy beast. Slowly, almost lazily, the shark opened his mouth, which was big enough to have swallowed a perambulator and made a lunch at the peach. They all watched a jest, and now, as they thought it a signal from the leader, all the other sharks came swinging in towards the peach, and they clustered around it and began to attack furiously. There must have been 20 or 30 of them at least, all pushing and fighting and lashing their tails and churning the water into froth. Panic broke out immediately on top of the peach. "Oh, we are finished now," cried Miss Spider, wrinking her feet. "They will eat up the whole peach, and then there'll be nothing left for us then on their all start on us." "She is right," shouted the ladybird. "We are lost forever." "Oh, I don't want to be eaten," wailed the earthworm. "But they will take my first of all, because I'm so fat and juicy and I have no bones." "Is there nothing we can do?" asked the ladybird to James. "Surely you can think of a way out of this." Suddenly, they were all looking at James. "Think," begged Miss Spider. "Think, James." "Come on," said the centipede. "There must be something we can do." Their eyes waited upon him, tense, anxious, pathetically, and hopeful. 20. "There is something that I believe we might try," James Henry Trotted said slowly. "I'm not saying it will work." "Tell us," cried the earthworm. "Tell us quickly. We try anything you say." The centipede said, "But hurry, be quiet and let the boy speak," said the ladybird. "Go on, James." They all moved a little closer to him. There was a longish pause. "Go on," they cried frantically. "Go on." And all the time while they were writing, they could hear the sharks threshing around in the water below them. It was enough to make anyone frantic. "Come on, James," the ladybird said, coaxing him. "I'm afraid it's not good after all," James mourned, shaking his head. "I'm terribly sorry. I forgot. We don't have any string. We need hundreds of yards of string to make this work." "What a sort of string?" the grasshopper sharply. Any sort, just so long as it's strong." "But my dear boy, that's exactly what we do have. We've got all you want." "How?" "The silkworm," cried the old grasshopper. "Didn't you ever notice the silkworm? She's still downstairs. She never moves. She just lies there sleeping all day long. But we can easily wake her up and make her spin." "And what about I asked," said Mr. Spider. "I can spin just as well as any silkworm. What's more, I can spin patterns." "Can you make enough between you?" asked James. "As much as you want." "And quickly?" "Of course." "And would it be strong?" "The strongest there is. It's as thick just as your finger." "But why? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to lift this peach clear out of the water," James announced firmly. "You are mad," cried the earthworm. "It's our only chance," the boy crazed. "He's joking." "Go on, James," the ladybird said gently. "How are you going to do it?" "Seagulls," James answered calmly. "The place is full of them. Look up there." They all looked up and saw a great mass of seagulls wheeling around and round the sky. "I'm going to take a long silk string, and I'm going to loop one end around a seagull neck, and then I'm going to tie the other end on the stem of the peach." He pointed the peach stem, which was standing up like a short, thick mast in the middle of the deck. "Then I'm going to get another seagull and do the same thing again and another. Ridiculously, they shouted. Madness. And the grasshopper said, how can you few seagulls lift an enormous thing like us into the air? And all of us well, it would be hundreds and thousands. There is no shortage for seagulls, James answered. Look for yourself. Well, probably need 400, 5 or 100, 600, maybe even 1,000, I don't know. I shall simply go on hooking them up to stem until we have enough to lift us. They'll be bound to lift us in the end. It's like a balloon. You give someone enough balloons to hold, really enough, then up it goes. And a seagull has far more lifting power than a balloon, if only we have the time to do it. You are absolutely out of your head, said the earthworm. How on earth do you propose to get a loop of string around a seagull neck? I suppose you're going to fly up there yourself and catch it. The boy Stotty said, the centipede. Let him finish, said the ladybird. Go on, James. How would you do it? With bait. Bait? What sort of bait? With a worm, of course. Seagulls love worms, didn't you know that? And luckily for us, we have here the biggest, fattest, pinkest, juicy earthworm in the world. You can stop right there, the earthworm said. That's quite enough. Go on, the other said. Begin to grow in the earth. Go on. The seagulls have already spotted him, James continued. That's why there are so many of them cycling around. But they daren't come down to get him while all the rest of us is standing here. So this is what? Stop, cried the earthworm. I won't have it. I refuse. Be quiet, said the centipede. Mind your own business. I like that. My dear earthworm, you're going to be eaten anyway, so what difference does it make whether it's shark or seagulls? I won't do it. Why don't we hear what the plan is at first, said the grasshopper. I don't give a hoot what the plan is, cried the earthworm. I'm not going to be pecked to death by a bunch of seagulls. You will be a martyr, said the centipede. I shall respect you for the rest of my life. So will I, said Miss Spider. And your name will be in all newspapers. Earthworm gives lives to save friends, but he won't have to give his life, James told them. Now listen to me. This is what we will do. 21. Why, it's absolutely brilliant, cried the grasshopper when James had explained his plan. The boy is a genius, the centipede announced. Now I keep my boots on after all. Oh, I shall be pecked to death, wailed the poor earthworm. Of course you won't. I will. And I won't even be able to see them coming at me because I have no eyes. James went over and put an arm gently around the earthworm's shoulder. I won't let touch you, he said. I promise I won't. But we got to hurry. Look down there. There were more sharks than ever around the beach. The water was boiling with them. There must have been 90 or 100 at least, and to the travelers up on top, it certainly seemed as saw that the beach were sinking lower and lower into the water. Action stations, James shouted. Jump to it. There's not a moment to lose. He was captain now, and everyone knew it. They would do whatever he told them. All hands below deck expect the earthworm, he ordered. Yes, they said eagerly as they scuttled into the tunnel entrance. Come on, let's hurry. And you, centipede, James shouted. Hop downstairs and get the silkworm to work at once. Tell her to spin as she never spun before. Our lives depend on it. And the same applies to you, Miss Spider. Hurry on. Start spinning. 22. In a few minutes, everything was ready. It was very quiet now on the top of the peach. There was nobody inside, nobody except the earthworm. One half of the earthworm, looking like a great, thick, juicy pink sausage, lay innocently in the sun for all the seagulls to see. The other half of him was dangling down the tunnel. James was crouching close beside the earthworm at the tunnel entrance, just below the surface, waiting the first seagull. He had a loop of silk string in his hand. The old grasshopper and the ladybird were further down in the tunnel, holding on to the earthworm's tail, ready to pull him quickly in out of danger as soon as James gave the word. And far below, in the greatest stone of the peach, the glowworm was lighting up the room so that the two spinners, the silkworm and Miss Spider, could see what they were doing. The centipede was down there too, exhorting them both frantically to greatest effort. And every now and again James could hear his voice coming up faintly from the depths shouting, "Spin, silkworm, spin, you great fat lazy brute. Faster, we throw you to the sharks." "Here comes the first seagull," whispered James. "Keep still now, earthworm, keep still. The rest of you get ready to pull." "Please, don't let it spike me," begged the earthworm. "I won't, psst." Out of the corner of an eye, James watched the seagull as it came swooping down towards the earthworm. And then suddenly, it was so close that he could see its small black eyes and its curved beak. And the beak was open, ready to grab a nice piece of flesh out of the earthworm's back. "Pull," shouted James. The grasshopper and the ladybird gave the earthworm's tail an enormous tug, and like magic the earthworm disappeared into the tunnel. At the same time, up went James, and the bird flew right into the loop of silk that he was holding out. The loop, which had been cleverly made, tightened just the right amount, but not too much, around the neck, and the bird was captured. "Hooray!" shouted the grasshopper, peering out of the tunnel. "Well done, James." Up flew the bird, with James paying out the silk string as it went. He gave it about 50 yards and then tied the string to the stem of the patch. "Next one," he shouted, jumping back into the tunnel. "Up you get again, earthworm. Bring up some more silk." "Oh, I don't like this at all," wailed the earthworm. "It only just missed me. I even felt the wind on my back as its wind was swishing past." "Shh," whispered James. "Keep still. Here comes another one." So they did it again, and again, and again. And the birds kept coming, and James caught them one after another, threaded them to the peach stem. 100 birds, he shouted, whipping the sweat from his face. "Keep going," they cried. The sharks, sensing that they were in danger of losing their prey, were hurling themselves at the peach more freezingly than ever, and the peach was sinking lower and lower still in the water. 500 birds, James thought. "Silkworm says she's running out of silk," yelled the centipede from below. She says she can't keep it much longer, nor can Miss Spider." "Tell them they've got to," James answered. "They can stop now. We are lifting," somebody shouted. "No, we're not." "I felt it." But in another bird, "Quick. Quick, everybody, quiet. Here's one coming now." This was the 501st bird, and the moment that James caught it on the thread, it to the stem with all the others, the whole enormous peach suddenly started rising up slowly out of the water. "Look out! Here we go! Hold on, boys!" But then it stopped, and there it hung. It hovered and swayed, but it went not higher. The bottom of it was just touching the water. It was like a delicate balanced seal that needed only the tiniest push to tip it on way or the other. "One more will do it," shouted the old green grasshopper, looking out the tunnel. "We are almost there." And now came this big moment. Quickly, the 502nd birds was caught and harnessed to the peach stem, and then, suddenly but slowly, majestically, like some fabulous golden balloon, with all the birds straining at the strings above, the giant peach rose up, dripping out of the water, and began climbing towards heaven. 23. In a flash, everybody was up on top. "Oh, isn't it beautiful?" they cried. "What a marvelous feeling. Goodbye, sharks." "Oh boy, this is the way to travel." Miss Spider, who was literally squealing with excitement, grabbed the centipede by the waist, and the two of them started dancing round and round the peach stem together. The earthworm stood up on his tail and did a sort of wriggle of joy all by himself. The old grasshopper kept hopping higher and higher in the air. The ladybird rushed over and shook James warmly by the hand. The glowworm, who at the best of times was very shy and silent, sat glowing with pleasure near the tunnel entrance. Even the silkworm, looking white and thin and completely exhausted, came out creeping out of the tunnel and watched this miracle. Up and up they went, and soon they were as high as the top of church steel above the ocean. "I'm a bit worried about the peach," James said to the others as soon as all dancing and shouting had stopped. "I wonder how much damage those sharks have done it underneath. It's quite impossible to tell from up here. Why don't I go over the side and make an inspection?" Miss Spider said. "I will be try to no trouble at all, I assure you." And without waiting for an answer, she quickly produced a length of silk thread and attached the end of the peach stem. "I'll be back in a sec," she said, and then she walked calmly over the edge of the peach and jumped off, paying out of the thread behind her as she fell. The others crowded anxiously around the place where she had gone over. "Wouldn't it be dreadful if the thread broke?" the ladybird said. There was rather a long silence. "Are you all right, Miss Spider?" shouted the old green grasshopper. "Yes, thank you," her voice answered from below. "I'm coming up now." And up she came, climbing foot over foot up the silk thread, and at the same time tucking the thread back cleverly into her body as she came past it. "Is it awful?" they asked her. "Is it all eaten away? Are there great holes in it everywhere?" Miss Spider clambered back on the deck, with a pleased but also rather puzzled look on her face. "You won't believe this," she said, "but there's hardly any damage done there at all. The peach is almost untouched. There are just a few tiny pieces out of it here and there, but nothing more." "You must be mistaken," James told her. "Of course she is mistaken," the centipede said. "I promise you I'm not," the spider answered. "But there were hundreds of sharks around us. They churned the water into the froth. We saw the great mouth openings and shutting. I don't care what you saw, Miss Spider." The curd certainly didn't do much damage to the peach. "Then why did we start sinking?" the centipede asked. "Perhaps we didn't start sinking," the old grasshopper suggested. "Perhaps we are all so frightened that we simply imagine it." This, in point of fact, was closer to the truth than any of them knew. A shark, you see, has an extremely long, sharp nose, and is set very awkwardly underneath its face and a long way back. This makes it more or less impossible for it to get its teeth into a vast, smooth, curving surface, such as the side of a peach. Even if the creature turns into its back, it still can't do it, because These snows always gets in the way. If you have ever seen a small dog trying to get into his teeth in an enormous ball, then you will be able to imagine roughly how it was with the shark and the peach. It must have been some kind of magic, the ladybird said. The holes must have healed up by themselves. Oh, look, there's a ship below us, shouted James. Everybody rushed to the side and peeped out. None of them had ever seen a ship before. It looks like a big one. It's got 3 funnels. You can even see the people on the decks. Let's wave to them. Do you think they can see us? Neither James nor any of the others knew it, but the ship that was now passing beneath them was actually the Queen Mary, sailing out of English Channel on her way to America. And on the bride of the Queen Mary, the astonished captain was standing with a group of his officers, all of them gaping at the great round ball hovering overhead. I don't like it, the captain said. Nor do I, said the first officer. Do you think it's following us? Said the second officer. I tell you, I don't like it, mourned the captain. It could be dangerous. That's it, cried the captain. It's a secret weapon. Holy Katz, send message to the Queen at once. The country must be warned and give me a telescope. The first officer handed a telescope to the captain. The captain put his eyes on. There's birds everywhere, he cried. The whole sky is teeming with birds. What in the world are they doing? And wait a second. There are people on it. I can see them moving. There's do I have the darned thing focused right? It looks like a boy in a short trousers. Yes, I can distinctly see a little boy in short trousers standing up there. And there's a sort of a giant ladybird. Now, just a minute, Captain, the first officer said. And colossal green grasshopper. Captain, the first officer said sharply. Captain, please. And a spider. Oh dear, he has been at the whiskey again, whispered the second officer. And an enormous centipede, screamed the captain. Call the ship's doctor, the first officer said. Our captain is now not well. A moment later, the great round ball disappeared into a cloud, and the people on the ship never saw it again. 24. But up on the beach itself, everyone was still happy and excited. I wonder where we will finish up this time, the earthworm said. Who cares? They answered. Sea eagles always will be back to the land sooner or later. Up on top they went, high above the highest clouds on the beach, swaying gently from the side or floated along. Wouldn't this be a perfect time for a little music, the ladybird asked. How about it, old grasshopper? With pleasure, dear lady, the grasshopper answered, bowing from the waist. Oh, hooray, he's going to play for us. They cried, and immediately the whole company set themselves down in the circle around the old green musician, and the concert began. From the moment the first note was struck, the audience became completely spellbound. And as for James, never had he heard such a beautiful music. In the garden at home on summer evenings, he had listened many times to the sound of grasshoppers chirping in the grass, and he had always liked the noise that they made. But this was different, kind of noisy altogether. This was real music, chords, harmonies, tunes, and all the rest of it. And what a wonderful instrument the grasshopper was playing upon. It was like a violin. It was almost exactly as though he were playing upon a violin. The bow of the violin, the part that moved was his black leg. The strings of the violin, the part that made the sounds, was the egg of his wing. He was using only the top of his back leg, and he was stroking this up and down against the edge of his wing with incredible skill, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast, but always with the same easy flowing action. It was preciously, the way a clever violinist would have used his bow, and the music came pouring out and filled the whole blue sky around them with magic melodies. When the first part was finished, everyone clapped madly, and Miss Spider stood up and shouted, "Bravo! Give us some more!" "Did you like that, James?" the old grasshopper asked, smiling at the small boy. "Oh, I love it," James answered. "It was beautiful. It was a saw that you had a real violin in your hand." "A real violin?" the grasshopper cried. "Good heavens, I like that. My dear boy, I am a real violin. It is a part of my own body." "But do all grasshoppers play their music on violins the same way as you do?" "No," he answered, "not all. If you want to know, I happen to be a short-horned grasshopper. I have two short feelers coming out of my head. Can you see them? They are quite short, aren't they? That's why they call me Shorthorn. And we Shorthorns are the only ones who play our music in the violin style using a bow. My long-horned relatives, the ones who have long curvy feelers coming out of their heads, make their music simply by rubbing the edges of their two top wings together. They are not violinists, they are wing rubbers, and a rather inferior noise these wing rubbers produce too, if I may say it. It sounds more like a banjo than a fiddle. How fascinating this is, cried James. And so think that up until now I had never ever even wondered how a grasshopper made his sound. My dear young fellow, the old green grasshopper said gently, there are a whole lot of things in this world, of course, that you haven't started wondering about. We are, for example, do you think that I keep my ears? Your ears? Why, in your head, of course. Everyone laughed. You mean you don't even know that? Cried the centipede. Try again, the grasshopper smiled at James. You can't possibly keep them anywhere else. Oh, can't I? Well, I give up. Where do you keep them? Right here, the grasshopper said. One on one each side of my tummy. It's not true. Of course it's true. What's peculiar about that? You ought to see where my cousin the crickets and the cattys keep theirs. Where do they keep them? In their legs. One in each front of the leg, just below the knee. You mean you didn't know that either? The centipede said. You're joking, James said. Nobody could possibly have ears in his legs. Why not? Because it's ridiculous, that's why. You know what I think is ridiculous, the centipede said, grinding away as usual. I don't mean to be rude, but I think it's ridiculous to have ears on the side of an head. It certainly looks ridiculous. You ought to take a peek in the mirror someday and see it for yourself. Pest, cried the earthworm. Why must you always be so rude and rumpinates to everyone? You ought to apologize to James at once. 25. James didn't want the earthworm on the centipede to get into another argument, so he said quietly to the earthworm, Tell me, do you play any kind of music? No, but I do other things, some of which are really quite extraordinary, the earthworm said, brightened. Such as what? Asked James. Well, the earthworm said, next time you stand in a field or in a garden and look around, then you just remember this. that every grain of soil upon the surface of the land, every tiny little bit of soil that you can see, has actually passed through the body of an earthworm during the last few years. Isn't that wonderful? It's not possible, said James. My dear boy, it's a fact. You mean you actually swallow soil? Like mad, the earthworm said proudly. In, on, and out there, other. But what's the point? What do you mean, what's the point? Why do you do it? We do it for the farmers. It makes the soil nice and light and crumbly, so that things will grow well on it. If you really want to know, the farmers couldn't do it without us. We are essential. We are vital. So it is only the natural that the farmer should love us. He loves us even more, I believe, than he loves the ladybird. The ladybird, said James, turning to look at her. Do they love you too? I am told that they do, the ladybird answered, blushing all over. In fact, I understand that in some places the farmers love us much that they go out and buy live ladybirds by the sackful and take them home and set them free in their fields. They are very pleased when they have a lot of ladybirds in their fields. But why? Because we gobble out all the nasty little insects that are gobbling up all the farmers' crops. It helps enormously, and we ourselves don't charge a penny for our services. I think you are wonderful, James told her. Can I ask you a special question? Please do. Well, is it really the truth that I can tell how old a ladybird is by counting the spots? Oh no, that's just a silly story, the ladybird said. We never change our spots. Some of us curs are born with more and others with less, but we never change them. The number of spots that a ladybird has is simply a way of showing which branch of the family she belongs to. I, for example, as you can see for yourself, I am a 9-spotted ladybird. I am very lucky. It's a fine thing to be. It is indeed, said James, gazing at the beautiful scarlet with 9 black spots on it. On the other hand, the ladybird went on, some of my less fortunate relatives have no more than 2 spots altogether on their shells. Can you imagine that? They are called 2-spotted ladybirds, and very common, ill-mannered they are, I regret to say. And then, of course, you have the 5-spotted ladybirds as well. They are much nicer than the 2-spotted ones. Also, I myself find them trifles too saucy for my taste. But they are all of them loved, said James. Yes, the ladybird answered quietly. They are all loved. It seems that almost everyone around here is loved, said James. How nice this is. Not me, cried the centipede. I'm a pest and I'm a prude of it. Oh, I'm such a socking, dreadful beast. Hear, hear, the earthworm said. But what about you, Miss Spider? Asked James. Aren't you also much loved in the world? No, Miss Spider answered, sighing long and loud. I'm not loved at all, and yet I do nothing but good. All day long I catch flies and mosquitoes in my webs. I'm a decent person. I know you are, said James. It is very unfair, the way we spiders are treated, Miss Spider went on. Why, only last week your own horrible Aunt Sponge flushed my poor dear father down in the plug hole in the bath tube. How awful, cried James. I watched the whole thing from the corner up in the ceiling, Miss Spider mourned. It was ghastly. We never saw him again. A large tear down her cheek and fell a splash on the floor. But is not very unlucky to kill a spider? James inquired, looking around at the others. Of course it's unlucky to kill a spider, shouted the centipede. It's about the unluckiest thing anyone can do. Look what happened to Aunt Sponge after she done that. We all felt it didn't, as the peach went over her. Oh, what a lovely bump that must have been for you, Miss Spider. It was very satisfying, Mrs. Spider answered. Will you sing us a song about it, please? So the centipede did. Aunt Sponge was terribly fat, and tremendous flappy at that. Her tummy and waist were as soggy as paste. It was worse on the place where she sat. So she said, I must make myself flat. I must make myself sleek as a cat. I shall do without dinner to make myself thinner. But along came the peach. Oh, the beautiful peach, and made her far thinner than that. That was very nice, Miss Spider said. Now, sing one about Aunt Spiker. With pleasure, the centipede answered, whining. Aunt Spiker was thin as a wire, and dry as a bone, only drier. She was so long and thin, if you carried her in, you could use her for poking the fire. I must do something quickly, she frowned. I want fat. I want pound upon pound. I must eat lots and lots of marshmallows and coals, till I start bulging out all around. Ah, yes, she announced, I have sworn that all alter my figure by dawn, cried the peach with a snigger. I will alter your figure, and I round her out in the lawn. Everybody clapped and called out for more songs from the centipede, who at once launched into his favorite song of all. Once upon a time, when pigs were swine, and monkeys chewed tobacco, and hens took snuff, to make themselves tough, and the ducks said quack, and the porcupines drank fire wines, and goats ate tuppi, and old Mother Hubbard got stuck in this. Look out, centipede, cried James. Look out. 26. The centipede, who had begun dancing wildly round the deck during this song, had suddenly gone too close to the downward curving edge of the peach, and for 3 awful seconds he had stood tottering on the brink, swinging his leg frantically in the circles in effort to stop himself from falling over backward into the space. But before anyone could reach him, down he went. He gave a shriek of terror as he fell down, and the others, rushing to the side and peering over, saw the poor long tumbling over and over through the air, getting smaller and smaller, until he was out of sight. Silkworm, yelled James. Quick, start spinning. The silkworm sighed, for she was still very tired from spinning all that silk for the birds, but she did as she was told. I'm going down after him, cried James, grabbing the silk string as it started coming out of the silkworm and tying the end of it around his waist. The rest of you hold on, silkworm, so I don't pull her over with me. And later on, if you feel the tugs and the string start hauling me up again. He jumped and he went tumbling down after the centipede, down and down towards the sea below, and you can imagine how quickly the silkworm had spun to keep it up the speed of his fall. We never see either of them, cried the ladybird. Oh dear, just when we all read so happy too. Miss Spider, the glowworm, and the ladybird all began to cry, so did the earthworm. I don't care a bit about the centipede, the earthworm said, but I really did love the little boy. Very softly, the grasshopper started to play the funeral march on his violin, and by the time he had finished, everyone, including himself, was in a flood of tears. Suddenly, there came 3 sharp taps on the rope. Pull, shouted the grasshopper. Everyone get behind me and pull. There was about a mile of string to be hauled in, but they all worked like mad, and in the end, over the side of the Peach, there appeared a dripping wet James with a dripping wet centipede clinging to him tightly with all 42 of his legs. "He saved me," gasped the centipede. "He swam around the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to find me." "My dear boy," the grasshopper said, "I don't congratulate you." "My boots," cried the centipede. "Just look at my precious boots. They are ruined by the water." "Be quiet," the earthworm said. You're lucky to be alive." "Are we still going up?" asked James. "We certainly are," answered the grasshopper, "and it's beginning to get dark." "I know. It will be soon to be night." "Why don't we all go down below and keep warm until tomorrow morning?" Miss Spider suggested. "No," the grasshopper said. "I think that would be very unwise. It will be safer if we all stay up here through the night and keep watch. Then, if anything happens, we shall anyway be ready for it." 27. James and his companions crouched closer together on top of the Peach as the night began closing around them. Cloud-like mountains stood high above their heads on all sides, mysterious, overwhelming. Gradually, it grew darker and darker, and then a pale three-quarter moon came up over the tops of the clouds and cast an eerie light on the whole scene. The giant Peach swayed gently from side to side as it floated along, and the hundreds of silky white strings going upward from its time were beautiful in the moonlight. So also was the great flock of birds overhead. There was not a sound anywhere. Traveling upon the Peach was not at least like traveling in an airplane. The airplane comes clattering on, roaring through the sky, and whatever might be, looking secretly up there in a great cloud mountains, goes running for cover at its approach. That is why people who travel in airplanes never see anything. But the Peach was soft, still, and travel making no noise at all as it floated along. And several times during that long silent night ride high up over the middle of the ocean in the moonlight, James and his friends saw things that no one had ever seen before. Once, as they drifted slightly past a massive white cloud, they saw on top of it a group of strange, tall, wispy-looking things that were about twice the height of an ordinary man. They are not easy to see, first because they were almost as white as the clouds itself. But as the Peach sailed closer, it became obvious that these things were actually living creatures, tall, wispy, light-like, shadowy white creatures who looked as thought they were made out of mixture of cotton wool and candy floss and thin white hairs. "Oh," the ladybird said, "I don't like this at all." "Shh," James whispered back. "Don't let them hear you. They must be cloudmen." "Cloudmen?" they murmured, huddling closer together. "Oh dear, I'm glad I'm blind and can see them," the earthworm said, "or I would probably scream." "I hope they don't turn around and see us," Miss Spider stammered. "Do you think they would eat us?" the earthworm asked. "They would eat you," the centipede answered, grinning. "They would cut you up like a salami and eat you in slices." The poor earthworm began quicker all over with fright. "But what are they going to do?" the grasshopper whispered. "I don't know," James answered. "Let's watch and see." The cloudmen were all standing in a group, and they were doing something peculiar with their hands. First, they would reach out, all of them at once, and grab handful of clouds. Then they would roll this handful of cloud in their fingers until they turned into what looked like large white marbles. Then they more bites of cloud and start over again. It was all very silent and mysterious, but the pile of marbles beside them kept growing larger and larger. Soon, there were a truckload of there at least. They must be absolutely mad, the centipede said. There's nothing to be afraid of here. But be quiet, you pest, the aardvark whispered. We shall all be eaten if they see us. But the cloudmen were much too busy with what they were doing to have noticed the great peach floating silent up behind them. Then the watchers on the peach saw one of the cloudmen raising his long wispy arms above his head and heard him shouting, "All right, boys, that's enough. Get the shovels," and all the other cloudmen immediately let out a strange high-pitched whoop of joy and started jumping up and down and waving their arms in the air. Then they picked up enormous shovels and rushed over to the pile of marbles and began shoveling them fast as they could over the side of cloud in the space. Down they go, they chanted as they worked. Down they go, hail and snow, freezes and sneezes and noses will blow. It's hailstone, whispered James excitedly. They be making hailstones, and now they are showering them down on the people in the world below. Hailstones, the centipede said. That's ridiculous. This is summertime. You don't have hailstones in summertime. They are practicing for the winter. I don't believe it, shouted the centipede. Shh, the others whispered, and James said softly, For heaven's sake, centipede, don't make such a noise. The centipede roared with laughter. Those impickles couldn't hear anything, he cried. They are deaf as doorknobs, you watch. And before anyone could stop him, he had cupped his front feet to his mouth and was yelling to the cloudman as loud as he could. Idiots, he yelled. What on earth do you think you're doing over there? The effect was immediately. The cloudmen jumped around as if they had been stung by wasps, and when they saw the great golden peach floating past them, not 50 yards away in the sky, they gave a yell of surprise and dropped their shovels to the ground. And there they stood with the moonlight streaming down all over them, absolutely motionless, like a group of tall, white, hairy statues staring and staring at the giant fruit as it went sailing by. The passengers on the peach sat frozen with terror, looking back at the cloudmen and wondering what was going to happen next. Now you are done it, you loathsome pest, whispered the earthworm to the centipede. I'm not frightened of them, shouted the centipede, and to show everybody once again that he wasn't, he stood up at his full height and started dancing about and making insulting signs at the cloudmen. This evidently infuriated the cloudmen beyond belief. All at once they spun around and grabbed a great handful of hailstones and rushed to the edge of the cloud and started throwing them at the peach, striking with fury all the time. Look out, cried James. Quick, lie down, lie flat, all on deck. It was luck they did. A large hailstone can hurt you as much as a rock of a lump of a lead if it's thrown hard enough. And my goodness, how those cloudmen could throw. The hailstone came whizzing through the air like bullets from a machine gun, and James could hear them smashing against the side of the peach and burying themselves in the peach flesh with horrible noises. Plop, plop, ping, as they pounced off the poor ladybird's shell because she couldn't lie as flat as the others, and then crack. as one of them hit the centipede right on the nose, again as another one hit somewhere else. "Oh," he cried, "oh, stop." But the Cloudman had no intention of stopping James. Could see them rushing about and get cloud-like, a lot of huggy, hairy ghosts, picking up hailstones from the pile, dashing them to the edge of the cloud, hurling them hailstones at the peach, dashing back to get more. And then, with the pile of stones was all gone, they simply grabbed handful of cloud and made as many more as they wanted, and much bigger ones, some of them as large as cannonballs. "Quickly," cried James, "down the tunnel, or we all be whipped out." There was a rush for the tunnel entrance, and half a minute later, everybody was safely downstairs inside the stone of the peach, trembling with fright and listening to the noise of the hailstone as they came crashing against the side of the peach. "I'm a wreck," groaned the centipede. "I'm wounded all over." "It serves you right," said the earthworm. "Would somebody kindly look and see if my shawl is cracked?" the ladybird said. "Give up some light," shouted the grasshopper. "I can't," wailed the glowworm. "They've broken my bulb." "Then put in another one," the centipede said. "Be quiet a minute," said James. "Listen, I do believe they're not hitting us anymore." They all stopped talking and listened. Yes, the noises had ceased. The hailstones were no longer smashing against the peach. "We left them behind. The sea must have pulled us away out of danger. Hooray! Let's go out and see." Cautiously, with James going first, they all climbed back up the tunnel. James poked his head out and looked around. It was all clear. "I can't see them anywhere." 28. One by one, the travelers came out again on the top of the peach and gazed carefully around. The moon was still shining as bright as ever, and there were still plenty of huge shimmering cloud mountains on all sides. But there were no cloudmen in sight now. "The peach is leaking," shouted the grasshopper, peering over the side. "It's full of holes, and the juice is dripping out everywhere." "That does it," cried the earthworm. "If the peach is leaking, then we shall surely sink." "Don't be an ass," the sentiment told him. "We are not in the water now." "Oh, look," shouted the ladybird, "over there." Everybody swung around to look. In the distance, directly ahead of them, they now saw a most extraordinary sight. It was a kind of arch, a colossal, shorey-shaped thing that reached high up in the sky and came down again at both ends. The ends were resting upon a huge flat cloud that was big as a desert. Now, what in the world is this? It's a bridge. It is an enormous hoop cut in half. Its giant horn shows standing upside down. "Stop me if I'm wrong," moaned the centipede, going white in the face. "But might those not be cloudmen climbing all over it?" There was a dreadful silence. The peach floated closer. "They are cloudmen. There are hundreds of them. 1,000. Millions." "I don't want to hear about it," shrieked the poor blind earworm. "I'd rather be on the end of fish hook and use the bait than come up against these terrible creatures again. I'd rather be fried alive and eaten by a Mexican," wailed the old green grasshopper. "Please keep quiet," whispered James. "It's our only hope." They crouched very still on top of the peach, staring at the cloudmen. The whole surface of the cloud was literally swarming with them, and there were hundreds more up above climbing about the mountainous crash. "But what is that?" whispered the ladybird. "And what are they doing?" "I don't care what they are doing," said the centipede, scuttling over the tunnel entrance. "I'm not staying up here. Goodbye." But the rest of them were too frightened or too hypnotized by the whole affair to make a move. "Do you know what?" James whispered. What, they said. That enormous arch, they seemed to painting it. They've got posts of paint and big brushes, look. And he was quite right. The travelers were close enough now to see that this was exactly what the cloudmen were doing. They all had a huge brush in their hands, and they were splashing the paint on the great curvy edge in frenzy of speed, so fast, in fact, that in a few minutes the whole of the arch became covered with the most glorious colors: red, blue, green, and purple. It's a rainbow, everyone said at once. They are making a rainbow. Oh, isn't it beautiful? Just look at those colors. Centipede, they shouted. You must come up and see this. They were so enthralled by the beauty and brilliance of the rainbow that they forgot to keep their voice low. The centipede poked his head cautiously out of the tunnel entrance. Well, he said, I've always wondered how those things were made. But why all the ropes? What are they doing with the ropes? God heavens, they are pushing it off at the cloud, cried James. There it goes. They are lowering it down to earth with ropes. And I'll tell you something else, the centipede said. If I'm not greatly mistaken, we ourselves are going to bump right into it. Bless my soul, he's right, the grasshopper screamed. The rainbow was now dangling in the air below the cloud. The peach was also just below the level of the cloud, and it was heading directly toward the rainbow. We are lost, Miss Spider cried, wringing her feet again. The end has come. It can't stand it, wailed the earthworm. Tell me what's happening. We are going to miss it, shouted the ladybird. No, are we not? Yes, we are. No, yes, no. Oh, my heavens, hold on, everybody, James called out, and suddenly there was a tremendous thud as the peach went crashing into the rainbow. This, followed by an awful splintered noise as the enormous rainbow snapped right across the middle and became two separate pieces. The next thing that happened was extremely unfortunate. The ropes that the cloudmen had been using for lowering the rainbow got tangled up with the silk strings that went up from the peach. The peach was trapped. Panic and pandemonium broke out among the travelers, and James, glancing up quickly, saw the faces of the 1,000 cloudmen peering down at him over the edge of the cloud. The faces had almost no shape at all, because of the long white hairs they covered them. There were no noses, no mouths, and no ears. Only the eyes were visible in each face. Two small black eyes glinting malevolently through the hairs. Then came the most frightening thing of all. One cloudman, a huge hairy creature who must have been 14 feet tall at least, suddenly stood up and made a tremendous leap off the side of the cloud, trying to get on of the silk strings above the peach. James and his friends saw him go flying through the air above them, his arms outstretched in front of him, reaching for the nearest string. And they saw him grab it and cling to the white hands and legs. And then, very, very slowly, hand over hand, he began to come down the string. Merci, help, save us, cried the ladybird. He's coming down to eat us. Jump overboard. Then eat the earthworm first, shouted the centipede. It's no good eating me. I'm full of bones like a kipper. Centipede, yelled James. Quickly, bite through that string, the ones he's coming down on. The centipede rushed over the stem of the peach and took the silk string in his teeth and bite through. Immediately, far above them, a single bird was seen to come away from the rest of the flock and go flying off with a long string trailing from its neck, and clinging desperately to the end of the string, shouting and cursing with fury was the huge hairy cloudman. Up and up he went, swinging across the moonlight sky, and James, watching him with delight, said, "My goodness, he must weigh almost nothing at all for one bird to be able to pull him up like that. He must be all hair and air." The rest of the cloudmen were so flabbergasted at seeing one of their company carried away in this manner that they let go the ropes they were holding. And then, of course, down went the rainbow, both halves of it together tumbling toward the earth. This freed the peach, which at once began sailing away from the terrible cloud. But the travelers were not in the clear yet. The influid cloudmen jumped up and ran after them along the cloud, peddling them with all sorts of hard and horrible objects. Empty paint buckets, paint brushes, rotten eggs, dead rats, bottles of hair oil, anything those brutals could lay their hands on came rainbow down on the peach. One cloudman, taking very careful aim, tipped a gallon of thick purple paint over the edge of the cloud right on the centipede himself. The centipede screamed with anger. "My legs," he cried. "They're all sticking together. I can't walk, and my eyelids won't open. I can't see, and my boots." But for the moment everyone was far too busy doing the things the cloudmen were throwing to pay any attention to the centipede. "The paint is drying," he moaned. "It's going hard. I can't move my legs, and I can't move anything." "You can still move your mouth," the earthworm said, "and that is great pity." James bawled the centipede. "Please help me. Wash off this paint. Scrape it off. Anything." 29. It seemed like a long time before the birds were able to pull the peach away from the horrible rainbow cloud. But they managed it at least, and then everybody gathered around the wretched centipede and began arguing about the best way to get the paint off this body. He really did like the sight. He was purple all over. And now that the paint was beginning to dry and harden, he was forced to visit very stiff and upright, as though he were encased in cement, and all 42 of his legs were sticking out straight in front of him like rods. He tried to say something, but his lips wouldn't move. All he could do now was to make gurgling noises in his throat. The grasshopper reached out and touched him carefully on the stomach. "But how could it possibly have dried so quickly?" he asked. "It's rainbow paint," James answered. "Rainbow paint dries very quick and very hard." "It detests paint," Miss Spider announced. "It frightens me. It reminds me of Aunt Spiker. The late Aunt Spiker. I mean, because the last time she painted her kitchen ceiling, my poor darling grandmother stepped into it by mistake when it was still wet, and there she stuck. And all through the night we could hear her calling to say, 'Help!' And it was heartbreaking to listen to her. But what could we do? Not a thing, until the next day when the paint had dried, and then, of course, we all rushed over to her and calmed her down and gave her some food. Believe it or not, she lived for 6 months like that, upside down on the ceiling with her legs stuck permanently in the paint. She really did. We fed her every day. We bought her fresh flies straight from the web. But then on the 26th of April, Aunt Sponge, the late Aunt Sponge, happened to glance up the ceiling, and she spotted her. "A spider," she cried. "A disgusting spider. Quick, fetch my mop with the long handle." And then, oh, it was so awful I can't even talk about it. Miss Spider whipped away a tear and looked sadly at the centipede. "You poor thing," she mourned. "I do feel sorry for you." "It never come off," the earthworm said brightly. "Our centipede will never move again. He will turn into a state, and we shall be able to put him in the middle of the lawn with a bird bath on the top of his head. We could try peeling him like a banana," the old grasshopper said. Or rubbing him with sandpaper, the ladybird said. Now, if he stuck out his tongue, the earthworm said, smiling a little, the first time in his life, if he stuck it out really far, then we could all catch hold of it and start pulling. And if we pulled hard enough, we could turn him inside out and he would have a new skin. There was a pause while the others considered this interesting proposal. I think, James said slowly, I think that is the best thing to do. Then he stopped. What was that? He asked quickly. I hear a voice. I heard something shouting. 30. They all raised their heads, listening. Shh! There is it again. But the voice was too far away to hear what it was saying. It's a cloud man, Miss Spider cried. I just know it's a cloud man. They are after us. It came from above, the earthworm said, and automatically everybody looked upward. Everybody except the centipede who wouldn't move. Ouch, said it. Help, mercy, we're going to catch it this time. For what they know, so swirling and twisting directly over their heads was an immense black cloud, a terrible, dangerous, thunder-looking thing that began to rumble and roar even as they were staring at it. And then from the high up and the top of the cloud, the faraway voice came down, for very loud and clear. One with the faucets, he shouted. One with the faucets. One with the faucets. 3 seconds later, the hole underneath of the cloud seemed to split and burst open like a paper bag, and then out came the water. They saw it coming. It was quite easy to see because it wasn't just raindrops. It wasn't raindrops at all. It was a great solid mass of water that might have been a lake or a whole ocean dripping out of the sky on top of them. And down it came, down and down and down, crashing first on the top bird and then on the peach itself, while the poor travelers shrieked with fear and grouped around frantically for something to catch hold of. The peach stem, the silk strings, anything they could find, and all the time the water came pouring and roaring down upon them, bouncing and smashing and sloshing and slashing and swashing and swirling and surging and whirling and gurgling and gushing and crushing and rushing. And it was like being pinned down underneath the biggest waterfall in the world and not being able to get out. They couldn't speak. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. And James Henry Trotter, holding madly the one of the silk strings above the peach, told himself that this must surely be the end of everything at last. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the deluge stopped. They were out of it and it was all over. The wonderful birds had flown right through it and came out of the safely on their side. Once again, the giant peach was sailing peacefully through the mysterious moonlight sky. I'm drowning, gasped the grasshopper. It's gone right through my skin, the earthworm groaned. I always thought my skin was waterproof, but it isn't. Look at me, shouted the centipede, excited. It was washed me clean. The pain's all gone. I can move again. That's the worst news I had in a long time, the earthworm said. The centipede was dancing around the deck and turning somersaults in the air and singing at the top of his voice. Oh, hooray for the storm and the rain. I can move. I don't feel any pain. And now I am pest. I am the biggest and best, the most marvelous pest once again. Oh, do shut up, the grasshopper said. Look at me, cried the centipede. Look at me. I am freed. I'm freed. Not the scratch, not a bruise, not a bleed. To his grave this fine gent. They all through they had sent. And I very near went. Oh, I very near went. But they sent quite the wrong centipede. 31. How fast we are going all of the sudden, the ladybird said. I wonder why. I don't think that the birds like this place any better than we do, James answered. I imagine they went to get out as soon as they can. They got a bad frighten on the storm we just been through. Faster and faster flew the birds skimming across the sky at a tremendous pace, with the peach trailing out behind them. Cloud after cloud went by one either side, all of them ghostly white in the moonlight, and several more times during the night the travelers caught glimpses of cloudmen moving around on the tops of these clouds, working their sinister magic upon the world below. Once they passed a snow machine in operation, with the cloudmen turning the handle and blizzard of snowflakes blowing out of the great funnel above. They saw the huge drums that were used for making thunder, and the cloudmen beating them furious with long hammers. They saw the frost and factories and the wind produced and the places where cyclones and tornadoes were manufactured and sent spinning down toward the earth. And once, deep in the hollow of the large pillow cloud, they spotted something that could only have been a cloudman's sight. There were caves everywhere, running into the cloud, and in the entrance of the caves cloudmen's wives were crouching over little stoves with frying pans in their hands, frying snowballs for their husbands' suppers. And hundreds of cloudmen's children were frisking about all over the place and shrieking with laughter and sliding down billows of the clouds. An hour later, just before dawn, the travelers heard a soft swooshing noise above their heads, and they glanced up and saw an immense great bakal creature swooping down towards them out of the dark. It circled round and round the peach, flapping its great wings slowly in the moonlight and staring at the travelers. Then it uttered a series of long, deep, melancholy cries and flew off again into the night. Oh, I do wish the morning would come, Miss Spider said. It won't be long now, James answered. Look at this getting lighter over it already. They all sat in silence, watching the sun that came up slowly over the rim of the horizon for a new day. 32. And when the full daylight come at least, they all go to their feet and stretch their poor cramped bodies. And then the centipede, who always seemed to see things first, shouted, Look, there's land below. He's right, they cried, running to the edge of the peach. Hooray, it looks like streets and houses. But how enormous it all is. A vast city, glistening in the early morning sunshine, lay spread over their 1,000 feet below them. At the height, the cars were like little battlegrounds along the streets, and people walking on the pavements looking no larger than tiny grains of soot. But what tremendous tall building, exclaimed the ladybird. I've never seen anything like them before in England. Which town do you think it is? This couldn't possibly be England, said the grasshopper. Where is it? Asked Miss Spider. You know what those buildings are, shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement. Those are skyscrapers. So this must be America, and that my friends mean that we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight. You don't mean it, they cried. It's not possible. It's incredible. Oh, I always dreamed of going to America, cried the centipede. I had a friend once who... Be quiet, said the earthworm. Who cares about your friend? The thing we got to think about now is how on earth we going to get down. Ask James, said the ladybird. I don't think that should be very difficult, James told them. All we have to do is to cut loose a few birds, not many, mind you, but just enough so that the others quite keep us in the air. Then Down we shall go, slowly and gently, until we reach the ground. 33. Far below them, in the city of New York, something like Panambus was breaking out. A great round ball as big as a house had been sight hovering up the sky over the center of Manhattan, and the cry had gone up that it was enormous bomb sent over another country to blow the whole city. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio and television programs were interrupted with announcement that the population must go down into the cellar immediately. 1 million people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up in the sky and saw the monster hovering above them and started running for their nearest subway entrance to take over. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they couldn't think of. The mayor of New York called up the president of the United States down in Washington to ask him for help, and the president, who at that moment was having breakfast in his pajama, quickly pushed away in his half-finished plate of sugar crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon his admirals and generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America, in all the 50 states from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded and the word went out that the biggest bomb in history of the world was hovering over New York City. 34. Come on, centipede, bite through the first string, James ordered. The centipede took one of the silk strings between his teeth and bite through. And once again, a single bird came away from the rest of the flock and went flying off in its own. Bite another. The centipede bite another string. Why aren't we sinking? We are sinking. No, we're not. Don't forget the peach is a lot lighter now than we started out, James told them. It lost an awful lot of juice when all those hailstones hit the night. Cut away 2 more, centipede. Ah, that's better. Here we go. Now we really sink. Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, centipede, or we sink too fast. Gently does it. Slowly the great peach began losing high and the buildings and streets down below began coming closer and closer. Do you think we all got our pictures in the papers when we get down? My goodness, I've forgotten to polish my boots, the centipede said. Everyone must help me to polish my boots before we arrive. Oh, for heaven's sakes, the earthworm said. Can't you even stop think about? But he never finished his sentence. For suddenly, whoosh! And they looked up and saw a huge 4-angled plane coming shooting out of a nearby cloud and go whizzing past them, not more than 20 feet over their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago, and as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings, and immediately the birds broke away, and the enormous peach, having nothing to hold it on air no longer, it went tumbling down toward the earth like a lump of lead. Help, cried the centipede. Save us, cried Miss Spider. We are lost, cried the ladybird. This is the end, the grasshopper grasped. James, cried the earthworm. Do something. I can't, cried James. I'm sorry. Goodbye. Shut your eyes. I won't be long now. 35. Round and upside down went the peach as it plumped towards the earth, and they were all clinging desperately to the seam to save themselves from being flung into space. Faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the house and streets below, where it would surely smash into a million pieces when it hit. And all the way along Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, people who had not yet reached the underground shelters looked up and saw it coming. And they stopped running and stopped staring in a sort of stupor at what they thought was bigger bomb and all the world falling out of the sky on their heads. A few women screamed, others knelt down on the sidewalks and began to pray. Strong men turned to another and said things like, "I get this is it, Joe, and goodbye, everybody." And for the next 30 seconds, the whole city held his breath, waiting for the end to come. 36. "Goodbye, Lady Bird," gasped James, clinging to the stem of the fallen peach. "Goodbye, Centipede. Goodbye, everybody." There were only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in among all the tallest buildings. James could see the skyscrapers rushing up to meet them at the most awful speed, and most of them had squared the flat tops. But the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered off into a long, sharp point, like an enormous silver needle sticking up in the sky, and it was precisely on the top of the needle that the peach fell. There was the squelch, the needle went in deep, and suddenly there was this giant peach caught on a spike upon the pinnacle of the Empire State Building. 37. It was really an amazing sight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realized that this now couldn't be possible a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at the marvel. The streets for half a mile around the building were jammed with the men and women, and when the word spread that there was actual living things moving about on top of the great round ball, then everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer," they shouted. "They are from outer space. They are men from Mars. Or maybe they came from the moon." And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said, "They look pretty peculiar to me, I tell you that." Police cars and fire engines came screaming in from of all the city and pulled outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and were up in the elevators as high as they could go. Then they poured out on the observation roof, which is a place where the tourists stand, just at the bottom of the bike spike. All the policemen were holding their guns at the ready with their fingers on the trigger, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood almost directly underneath the peach, they couldn't actually see the travelers up on top. "Ahoy there," shouted the chief of police. "Come out and show yourself." Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large as a round, threw marvelous glare down on the police and the firemen below. Then his mysterious ugly face broke into white grin. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting. "Look out," they cried. "It's a dragon." "It's not a dragon, it's a wampus." 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's a snoozwanger. It's a wangdoodle." The centipede kept on grinding. He seemed to be enjoying enormous the commotion that was causing. "Now, see here," shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth. "You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you come from." "We come from thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his brown teeth. "There you are," called the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." "I guess you are right," said the head of the fire department. At this point, the grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the peach, along the side of the centipedes. 6 more big strong men fainted when they saw him. "That's one onyx," screamed the head of the fire department. "Or a cockatrice," yelled the chief of police. "Stand back, men. It may jump down on us any moment." What on earth they are talking about, the grasshopper said to the centipede. Search me, the centipede answered. But they seemed to be in an awful stew about something. Then Miss Spider's large black murderous-looking head, which to a strange was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshopper. Snakes and ladders, yelled the head of the fire department. We are finished now. It's a giant scorpula. It's worse than that, cried the chief of police. It's a venomous kind. Oh, just look at this vermicious groom's face. Is that the kind that eats full-grown men for breakfast? I'm afraid it is, the chief of police answered. Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us to go down from here? Miss Spider called out. It's making me giddy. This could be a trick, said the head of fire department. Don't anyone make a move until I say. They've probably got space guns, muttered the chief of police. But we got to do something, the head of the fire department announced. About 5 million people are standing down there in the streets watching us. Then why don't you put up your ladder? The chief of police asked. I will stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you, while you go up and see what's happening. Thanks very much, snapped the head of the fire department. Soon there were no less than 7 large fantastic faces peering down over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the grasshoppers, the spiders, the earthworms, the ladybirds, the silkworms, and the glowworms. And a sort of panic was breaking among of the firemen and the policemen. Then, all at once, the panic stopped and a great gasp of astonishment went up. For now a small boy was seen standing up there beside the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, "Hello, everybody!" For a few moments, the men below just stood and stared and gaped. The simple couldn't believe their eyes. "Bless my soul," cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face. "It really is a little boy, isn't it?" "Don't be frightened of us, please," James called out. "We are so glad to be here." "What about those others beside you?" shouted the chief of police. "Are any of them dangerous?" "Of course they're not dangerous, James. They are the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you will believe me. My friend is the centipede, and let me take it now. He is so sweet and gentle that the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be cheerpon when nurse it off and all the royal children are alone. The earthworm on the earth hand, said James, begin to expand. It's great for digging up the land and making old soils never. Moreover, you should understand he would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and for making you a server. And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, it's a boon in a millions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune and he plays and plays and plays. As a toy for children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You only to tickle the soles of his feet and he hops and hops. And now, without excuse, I like to introduce the charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is easily to install on your ceiling and your wall, and also the snakes a bite of eccentricity. It's really rather clever, for thereafter you will never have the slightest need for using electricity. And here we have Miss Spider, with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to stay that she never meet Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet. If she had she not have frightened her way. Should her look sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you. To repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her and invite her in the nursery to play. And here's my darling ladybird, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she left them all behind. But they are coming on the next page of the can. And now the silkworm James went on, whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bite of silk that could compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff. And what is more, the silkworm had, I'll have you know, the Hannah not so long ago, to spin a wave and sew and press the Queen of England wedding dress. And she already made and sent a waistcoat for your president. 38. 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story of a group flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who had come over on the beach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of the city, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys swarmed up the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted, "We must now have a ticker-tape parade for our wonderful visitors." And so procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto the very large truck, and they had now sat looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom of it where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that, or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out of in the street? Behind the speech, skidding about all over the place, came the mayor's limousine, and behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowd went wild with excitement. They lined the streets and they leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and thick tape. And James and his friends stood up in their car and waved back at them as they went by. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along 50th Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. I won't keep forever." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running on the street. "Can we have some of it too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up on the truck and swarmed like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what happened spread quickly from streets to streets, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up 5th Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamilton has suddenly decided up in New York. And James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as these in the world, it was the most marvelous thing that happened ever. 39. And this journey ended, but the travelers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The centipede was made vice-president in charge of sales of high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made woman face cream to speak commercials on television. The silkworm and Miss Spider, after they had both been taught they make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The glowworm became the light inside the torch on the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electric bill. The grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The ladybird, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in the Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the famous house there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door, and the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous rooms where James and he'd first meet his friends. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you would find the grasshopper in there as well, resting peaceful in a chair before the fire, or perhaps it would be the ladybird who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip. Or the centipede to show off a new batch of particular elegance boots that had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvelous peach stone in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell again the story of his adventures on the peach, he thought he would be nice one day, sat down and wrote a book. So he did. And that is what you have just finished reading. Pooh! That was a very long book. I put it in 3 parts, and I'm happy that you stay until I'm now finished with the last part of it. I just can recommend you, if you not read the first parts already, do so. Click yourself through my playlist and see the first 2 parts and everything else what I have to offer. My name is Katz, and I'm a heavily tattooed girl who shows you the satisfaction of sound. And if you are not sleeping right now or so calmly relaxed that you can't move, feel free to follow, subscribe, click on the notification bell and comment that we will create together a little new ASMR world here. And I can tell you, without saying many more, this book is one of my new favorite ones. So nice written and lovely. Thank you so much for taking your time and listening to it.